We live in a world permeated by incest. A professor of anthropology from Rutgers University concluded that 80% of marriages in human history were incestuous. This is not a common cliché that everyone is related to each other. It's far more complex. By incest, he meant any marriage with a person within the third degree of kinship or closer. It would seem that throughout nearly all of human history, people lived with a strict taboo on close-kin relationships. But not everyone adhered to this rule. Among the societal elite, aristocrats and nobles, incest was a mechanism for seizing and maintaining power. Hypocrites urged common people to follow rules and church doctrines while themselves marrying close relatives to produce heirs. Today, I will tell you about the greatest dynasty of incest in history, the Habsburgs. They spent all their resources playing the game of power and ultimately lost. Their heirs often died at birth, and those fortunate enough to survive suffered for the rest of their lives. Yet, despite this, for 200 years, the Habsburgs were the greatest dynasty in the world. We will thoroughly explore how they managed to subjugate all of Europe, trace how the church used incest in politics, and, in the end, through tangled family trees, understand how incest destroyed an entire empire. This story feels more like a dramatic series than our classic videos. It's like Game of Thrones or Succession, except everything I'll talk about happened in real life. I'm Litvinus, and this is a channel where interesting history isn't just told, but also explained. Navigating 1,000 years of medieval history is no easy task. To some, it might seem like one big black hole. This perspective is understandable. Not all of us are historians. But even in the Middle Ages, there was one century that stood out for its level of cruelty and madness. We're in the 14th century, possibly the worst century in human history. What's happening there? The Crusades are coming to an end. England and France are embroiled in a bloody dynastic slaughter later called the 100 Years' War. Where Italy and Spain stand today, there is no unity. Italy is a collection of principalities and city-states, while Spain has been engaged in the Reconquista, the expulsion of Muslims from the peninsula, for 500 years. If you look further east, to Central Europe, there is no Germany. Instead, the colossal Holy Roman Empire looms large. However, behind the image of a giant lies a confederation of hundreds of princes and dukes incapable of unity. This is where most of our story today unfolds. And far to the east, Rus is enduring the invasion of the Tatar Mongols. That's the situation in the 14th century. But this is a bird's eye view. In art and culture, colossal shifts are taking place. Europe is emerging from a long period of cultural stagnation. Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch are laying the foundation for the future Renaissance. The world seems to be preparing for a great leap forward. Now, let's look at the 14th century through the eyes of its contemporaries. For them, it was perhaps the most difficult era in European history in the last 800 years. Consider just the plague epidemic, or the Black Death. Imagine, in 7 years, Europe lost between a third and half of its population. Literally every second person died, and often there was no one to bury the dead. Diseases didn't stop the numerous conflicts. European monarchs slaughtered each other over scraps of land on a regular basis. For the past 10 centuries, the territory of the former Roman Empire, after being overrun by barbarians, was engulfed in the flames of violence. Escaping it was impossible. You could move, for example, from northern France to the south, but by trading Orleans for Marseille, instead of being ravaged by the English, you'd have a splendid chance of ending up in slavery. The revival of trade in the late Middle Ages led to a rise in piracy. Pirates didn't just plunder ships, but also coastal towns. The unluckiest were taken to be sold in North Africa. Now, let's conduct a thought experiment. What would happen to you if you were unfortunate enough to be born in the 14th century? Most likely, you'd be part of a peasant family. Back then, 85% of Europeans were rural laborers. Let's say you escaped death from the first illness in infancy, and the plague either spared you or you miraculously survived it, leaving your body covered with dozens of scars as a memento. So far, no one has robbed or killed you. Success. But this is just the beginning of your suffering. Nature in the 14th century seemed to want people to suffer. The old warm climate was giving way to a colder one. Snow began falling not only in England and northern Germany, but even in Italy, something unseen in the previous 500 years. During the Great Famine at the start of the century, up to a quarter of the urban population died. People believed the end times were coming, that the Antichrist was about to arrive, and the world would end. From the 14th to the 19th century, up to the Industrial Revolution, peasants didn't live, they survived. It all sounds horrifying, I agree. But let's suppose you were lucky enough to be born into a wealthy and noble family. Forget about the concept of family as we know it in the 21st century. You're part of a dynasty. Your personal interests are worth less than a chamber pot. Everything is decided by the family patriarch. He determines what you'll study, when you'll marry, or whom you'll marry. Your task isn't to find happiness or live in luxury, but to increase the family's wealth. Those who've watched at least one season of Game of Thrones know what I'm talking about. In their castles, feudal lords controlled surrounding villages and collected taxes from them. Essentially, it was basic racketeering. Peasants paid feudal lords just for the possibility of protection from bandits in case of trouble. It's hard to call this system a full-fledged state. However, the 14th century didn't just shatter the lives of commoners, but also the elite. Wars and epidemics mowed down not only peasants, but also knights and nobles. The average life expectancy of a European aristocrat dropped from 64 to 45 years. Many didn't just struggle to maintain their standard of living, they were simply going extinct. But where there's a crisis, there are opportunities. On the scorched field called Europ, a lot of free space opened up. These niches began to be filled by new families, the Trastamaras in Spain, the Ottomans in what is now Turkey, and finally, our heroes today, the House of Habsburg. Through just 100 to 150 years, the Habsburgs would come to rule nearly all of Europe. At their peak, both the old and new worlds would be under their control. All of Europe would fear defying their will. And all this was thanks to their ability to skillfully choose husbands and wives. Who were these Habsburgs, and where did they come from? They were a rather ordinary family of landowners from Western Germany. Later, they would invent a grand genealogy for themselves, tracing their origins to none other than Julius Caesar, or even Aeneas, the founder of Rome. But these were all later legends meant to conceal and embellish their utterly mundane, and in some ways even pitiful origins. The first true Habsburg, named Guntram the Rich, lived in the 10th century and was an extremely greedy man. He demanded not only payment from peasants for using their own land, but also forced them to work on his fields. Those who refused were coerced by force. This might seem commonplace, but in the 10th century, serfdom didn't yet exist. Some believe Guntram was one of the founding fathers of the serf system. He would have continued exploiting peasants, but Guntram was not only rich but also treacherous. He betrayed the then emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and as a result, his lands were confiscated. Here, the Habsburg story could have ended before it even began, but the land confiscation was in favor of his heirs. They built the Habsburg Castle, which translates to Hawk's Castle. It still stands today. Look at this photo, an ordinary multi-story building with crooked windows. This is not how one imagines the castle of a great dynasty. The thing is, they simply didn't have the money or resources for anything more grandiose. Thus, the Habsburgs immediately earned a bad reputation. A terrifying legend tells of one of Guntram's descendants, already married to a noblewoman, who decided to have some fun. He seduced the daughter of a town craftsman, promising her a happy family life. But, as they say, promising is not the same as marrying. He abandoned her pregnant, and when she came demanding he keep his promises, he imprisoned her in a dungeon and starved her to death. As she died, the girl cursed the Habsburg family to ruin. However, this curse clearly had a delayed start function, like in modern washing machines. The dynasty not only didn't perish, but grew stronger. The Habsburgs developed a highly effective strategy. They understood they couldn't rely on military might, they lacked the money and resources. So, they pursued two paths. The first was to be skilled courtiers, securing lands from the Holy Roman Emperor for loyal service. But this required hard work, and failure could cost them their heads. The second path proved easier and more pleasant. The Habsburgs scoured Germany like an elite marriage agency, seeking wealthy heiresses from noble families and marrying them. The dowries in the form of lands were substantial. This was the essence of the Habsburgs. They treated marriage not as an expression of love or a spiritual union blessed by heaven, but as a cold calculation for financial and political gain. Such wild cynicism was typical of feudal lords of that era, but the Habsburgs broke all records for ruthlessness. The true champion of this strategy was Rudolf I. Under him, the dynasty secured its stronghold for centuries, Austria. He was not a pleasant man. Once, a neighboring count insulted him. In response, Rudolf invaded his lands, burning everything in his path, bribed the guards, stormed the castle, and personally killed the offender. However, Rudolf showed his key qualities as a typical Habsburg of his time, at court and in marriage dealings. He married a wealthy countess, which allowed him to enter the empire's high society, killing two birds with one stone, so to speak. Then he grew close to the emperor of the time, through flattery, gifts, and displays of loyalty. When a bishop rebelled against the emperor, Rudolf gathered troops and, under the cover of night, infiltrated his lands to burn a women's monastery with the nuns locked inside. It seems like lightning should have struck him on the spot for such an act, but life had no intention of punishing him for his sins. When the emperor died, it was Rudolf who became his successor in the Holy Roman Empire. The position of emperor was elective. To ascend the throne, one needed the support of the prince-electors. Rudolf had no trouble with this. One prince was his brother-in-law, and he bribed two others with marriage deals. With 11 children, finding opportunities for advantageous marriages was not difficult. In 1273, Rudolf Habsburg reached an incredible height. An ordinary landowner, through his cunning, became a full-fledged emperor. Through unscrupulousness, pragmatism, and excellent negotiation skills, the Habsburgs rose from the dirt to emperors. Everyone around them was driven by a thirst for power, but only the Habsburgs managed to turn this ambition into a true obsession that was passed down genetically. Times changed, but their aspirations remained the same. They continued to strengthen their position, make advantageous marriages, and occasionally wage successful wars. And now we're in the early 15th century. The world looks different than it did 200 years ago. America is being actively colonized by Europeans. The Renaissance, whose beginnings we saw in the 14th century, has developed and is pulling culture, science, and technology into the modern era. The Age of Empires begins. The Russian Tsardom is forming. France, under the Bourbons, is becoming a serious force on the continent. The Ottoman Empire is pushing from the Balkans into the heart of Europe, but encounters a rival it will never defeat, the Habsburgs. In 200 years, through calculated marriages, this dynasty of feudal lords subjugated Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and even northern Italy and the Benelux. Skillful marriages made them the masters of Europe, but the territories of the Holy Roman Empire were not enough for them. The Habsburgs dreamed of becoming monarchs of the entire Christian world. Look at their mottos. The first is an acronym of Latin vowels. Austria is destined to rule the world. Another slogan suggested how to achieve this. Let others wage wars, but you, happy Austria, marry. For if others are aided by Mars, Venus grants you a kingdom. But, as often happens, with wealth and power comes an acute sense of paranoia and fear of losing it all. The Habsburgs feared that one day a marriage contract with an untrustworthy neighbor would turn against them. They began to consolidate power within their own hands, resorting to incest. In 1820, a Christian missionary arrived in Hawaii. What he saw there shocked him. The local ruling families not only didn't condemn, but encouraged incest. Rulers married not only their cousins, but also their own sisters. Kinship degree didn't matter. For most peoples of the world, there are restrictions on incest, formed by humanity's centuries-long experience as a species. No 20th century genetic research was needed to reach the obvious conclusion: relationships between close relatives produce less healthy offspring. Over time, this logic took the form of traditions and religious prohibitions. However, this wasn't the case everywhere. For example, in ancient Egypt, incest in pharaohs' families was considered not just normal but natural. If a pharaoh was an earthly god, he shouldn't mix his blood with mere mortals. Many have heard of the Egyptian Queen Nefertiti, but often forget who her husband was. Most likely, she was married to her brother Akhenaten. Their marriage produced the owner of the most famous sarcophagus in history, Tutankhamun. However, Tutankhamun himself was less a person and more an encyclopedia of hereditary diseases. The young pharaoh could not walk without a cane due to bone necrosis in both feet and clubfoot. To turn his head, he had to rotate his entire body. He had a cleft palate on his face. Honestly, he only remotely resembled a deity. It's no surprise that he lived only 19 years and left no heir. He tried, but his relationship with his sister resulted only in the birth of 2 stillborn children. One would think that people would have realized from their own experience that such traditions were harmful, but the belief in blood purity proved stronger. By the way, even the famous Cleopatra, who lived 1,500 years after Tutankhamun, was married to 2 of her brothers in succession. In Europe, the tradition of incest never took hold. Incest was taboo long before Christ. This was most vividly expressed in the image of Oedipus from Greek myths, who accidentally married his own mother. The gods punished his entire people with a terrible disease, and Oedipus himself, upon learning of his deed, blinded himself. Even unintentional incest due to ignorance was considered a grave sin. The Romans also regarded incest with disgust. Marriage between relatives was a criminal offense. Incest became associated with the most despised emperors in Roman history, Caligula and Nero. Then Christianity entered the historical stage. The early Christians were considered radicals in relation to the surrounding society. They despised the traditions of their neighbors, rejected foreign gods, and openly declared that the people around them were praying to all sorts of nonsense. Roman customs seemed sinful and licentious to them. Naturally, Christians also condemned incest. However, even in their enemies, they saw people who strove to avoid incest. Augustine of Hippo wrote that pagans still tried not to break this important rule. By the way, regarding Christianity, many atheists, with a smirk, ask how the descendants of Adam and Eve avoided incest. Christian theologians never tried to find cunning explanations. Augustine himself plainly stated, yes, Cain and Abel married their sisters, but later, when the population grew, a strict prohibition was established. Let's return to the Middle Ages. Unlike other churches, the Catholic Church actively used its stance on incest for political purposes. In the 7th century, all power in Europe was in the hands of the kings of former barbarian states, and the Church was powerless, merely a tool in the hands of the authorities. Even the Pope was insignificant compared to a king or duke. This did not suit the Church authorities, and as a means to strengthen its influence, the Catholic Church chose the issue of incest. It took on the crucial role of interpreter, what constituted incest and what did not. Previously, incest applied only to relationships with close and first cousins, but the Church expanded this concept to include second cousins. Marrying a stepmother or a brother's former wife also became a sin. By the end of the 7th century, even relationships with godparents were considered incest, a violation not only of physical, but also spiritual kinship. These rules could not be ignored. The rich and powerful were excommunicated from the Church, while ordinary Christians faced death. These rules persisted even into the 15th century. Recall Henry VIII, who had 6 wives. He disposed of his second wife by accusing her of incest with her brother. Although the accusation was false, it did not prevent both from being beheaded. The circle of forbidden relationships expanded, and rulers sometimes struggled to determine whether their new marriage was sinful. Here, the Church came to the rescue. It mandatorily studied genealogies and determined whether a marriage was permissible. The church gained a mechanism of immense power. It could find grounds to prohibit almost any marriage or, conversely, turn a blind eye to kinship. The church began to be taken seriously, and papal authority, which forced emperors to capitulate, was largely born thanks to incest. These new marriage rules had another unexpected consequence: the strengthening of European individualism. According to recent studies, as church prohibitions intensified, ordinary people could no longer marry within their small communities. They had to seek partners outside them. In such conditions, large families and clans began to break apart, and communal ties lost their former significance. However, the role of the individual and individuality became much more prominent. But prohibitions aside, by the 14th century, a reverse process began in Europe's high society. Recall the plague epidemic. It not only killed half of Europe's population, but also made people realize that self-isolation was an excellent way to preserve health. Aristocrats, locked in their castles, began to ignore not only church prohibitions, but also rules of propriety. It was better to marry relatives living in your castle than to die of the plague. In the pursuit of love, incest became fashionable among the elite. In 1496, an event occurred that would change the fate of a dynasty, the so-called Mad Marriage. The heir to the Austrian house, Philip the Fair, married the young Spanish princess Joanna of Castile. Through her, the Habsburgs sought to gain the Spanish crown. Joanna came from a very complex family. Even by the standards of the aristocracy of that time, her parents were second cousins. This did not affect her physical health, but the issues lay deeper in her psyche. When Joanna first saw her betrothed, she fell madly in love with him. Philip was indeed considered handsome, and every court lady dreamed of being in his arms. He took advantage of this, even at his own wedding, paying attention not to his bride, but to her ladies-in-waiting. For Philip, the marriage was merely a political act, and he had no intention of loving Joanna for the rest of his life. His sole goal was the Spanish throne. For this purpose, all 6 of their children were born. But Joanna began to lose her mind. She was incredibly jealous of her husband and wouldn't leave his side. In a fit of emotion, she once attacked a rival, cut off her hair, and mutilated her face with scissors. When Philip realized his wife was going mad, he fled from her and the Spain he hated. Joanna took this very personally and fell into a deep depression. She stopped eating and refused to bathe for months. Eventually, her parents allowed her to join her husband, hoping it would improve her condition, but it only worsened. In the presence of the object of her passion, her madness intensified. She cut pieces of his clothing to keep them and beat any women who approached Philip. During arguments, she blackmailed him with hunger strikes. But the inevitable happened. Joanna's mother, the queen, died. The throne now belonged to Joanna, but under her father's regency. A real war broke out between her husband and father, full of intrigues and betrayals. This could have continued for a long time, but Philip contracted smallpox and died within days. If Joanna was merely unwell before, her condition now became critical. Her genetic background manifested fully. From then on, she was known only as Joanna. The Mad Joanna refused to bury her husband. Instead, she spent days gazing at his body. To prevent decomposition, his body was embalmed in honey. But even that wasn't enough for her. Joanna set off on a journey across Spain with her husband's corpse, telling it about local sites. The procession consisted only of men. Joanna wouldn't allow women near even her husband's dead body. The carriage with the corpse moved only at night, as Joanna feared crowds. At the time, she was in the last trimester of pregnancy. Years later, those around her grew tired of the situation, especially her children. Her son, now King Charles of Spain, visited her. He was shocked by his mother's condition. She was only getting worse. She didn't bathe and ate only bread. Most disturbingly, all this time, her young daughter remained with her, whom no one could take away from Joanna. She was the last reminder of her beloved Philip. In the end, Charles found no better solution than to confine his mother to a house. Her young daughter was freed from her mentally ill mother's captivity only 9 years later, when she was married off to the King of Portugal. Joanna herself spent another 39 years in solitude and died at the advanced age of 75. Joanna's fate foreshadowed the downfall of the Habsburgs. While Joanna was in voluntary forced confinement, the Habsburg Empire reached its peak. In 1533, Joanna's son, Charles I, ruled half of Europe: Austria, Spain, Bohemia, the Netherlands, much of Italy, and vast territories in the New World were in his hands. He was so great that the creation of a Christian empire under Habsburg rule seemed only a matter of time. In the 20th century, after World War II, Charles's policies were seen as a prototype of a united Europe, and he was called the father of the European Union. Among his contemporaries, Charles inspired awe. Some feared him, others immensely respected him, and he had almost no outright enemies. Charles worked tirelessly, sending his opponents to the scaffold. But his greatest adversary was not a politician but a theologian, Martin Luther. His 95 Theses and rejection of Catholic dogmas put an end to the idea of uniting Europe under a Catholic monarch. Charles failed to crush Protestantism in its infancy. Charles also had issues with his genes, though they didn't manifest as mental or severe physical disorders. He had an unusual appearance. One ambassador described his face as long, corpse-like, with a crooked mouth that opened when Charles was off guard. But the most striking feature was his lower jaw, the so-called Habsburg jaw, which truly stood out. During one of his trips through Spain, a peasant shouted at him, "Your Majesty, close your mouth. The flies in this country are very bold." However, something concerned Charles more than his jaw: preserving and expanding the dynasty's possessions. Looking back at his mother's family history, he made a conclusion that, as it turned out, was completely wrong. Charles established an unwritten rule: Habsburgs marry other Habsburgs. He started with himself. His wife was his first cousin. Of their 8 children, only 3 survived to adulthood, 2 girls and 1 boy. And here begins another Game of Thrones: how to arrange the marriages of his children to gain the greatest advantage. The 2 daughters became wives of their first cousins. But the only son, Philip II, had an interesting fate. He inherited not only the typical Habsburg appearance and sharp mind from his father, but also a fervent belief in the Catholic Habsburg Empire. He became the founder of the Spanish branch of the dynasty. He no longer controlled the German and Austrian possessions. Those went to his uncle Ferdinand. But he expanded the empire through neighboring Portugal, which, like almost everything Habsburg, came to him through successful marriages. However, there was no one to pass the empire to. His first wife, as per tradition, was his first cousin Maria. But their marriage was unsuccessful. She died at 17 during childbirth. The boy born survived, but was mentally and physically unwell. He displayed wild aggression toward everything around him. He might have become king, but he made a fatal mistake. He began plotting to assassinate his own father. The result was predictable. By 17, the heir to the throne died in his father's prison. With the first marriage and its consequences dealt with, we move on. Philip II's new wife was none other than the Queen of England, Mary, who went down in history as Bloody Mary. Mary was 12 years older than Philip, but still fell deeply in love with him. Philip, like his namesake, the famous grandfather, loved only power. If this marriage had produced heirs, the entire England would have joined the great Habsburg Empire. But it seems the heavens themselves were against such a union. In 1557, a strange new disease swept through England. What kind of fever it was, no one knows to this day. Its symptoms were so inexplicable. The disease primarily killed city dwellers and aristocrats, and among those not destined to survive was the English queen. This marriage, too, proved unsuccessful, but Philip didn't lose heart. He had already found a new, third wife, Elizabeth of France. True, the groom didn't attend the wedding ceremony, and a proxy stood in for him at the altar. Apparently, this was acceptable at the time. Despite this, their marriage was relatively successful. Philip genuinely loved Elizabeth, but the problem remained. They had 4 daughters, but no male heir appeared. Without one, the entire Habsburg concept of power was crumbling. Elizabeth couldn't withstand the pressure and died during the birth of their 5th daughter. There was still no heir, and Philip's time was running out. Without a son, the centuries-old empire built by his ancestors would begin to fall apart. Then he remembered that the only male heir to reach adulthood was from his first cousin. Incest didn't take long to resurface. Philip quickly found a new wife, his first cousin once removed. Finally, on the 11th attempt, in his 4th marriage, despite the inbreeding, the long-awaited heir was born. Relationships between first cousins became the hallmark of the Spanish branch of the dynasty, and many European monarchies adopted this tradition. For centuries, aristocrats, especially kings, married women not equal to them in status. But by the 15th century, feudalism had faded, and everything became the monarch's property, including the state itself. In such conditions, the idea of marrying someone of lower status seemed absurd. Who are they and who are we? This is how the international blue blood bride market began to operate. However, the Habsburgs were interested not just in marrying equals, but in preserving power. Attentive readers might ask, did the Church, which fought against incest for so many years, simply sit back and watch this madness unfold? Yes, that's more or less what happened. We mustn't forget who the Habsburgs were, the greatest family of their time. The era of the Church's strong authority was a thing of the past. When necessary, the Habsburgs could go to the Pope and quickly explain everything to him. Charles I once did just that. He captured Rome and set the city ablaze, resulting in the deaths of up to 50,000 civilians. And even despite such actions, the Habsburgs maintained a reputation as defenders of the Catholic Church in its fight against Protestantism. The Catholic Church needed the Habsburgs and therefore constantly turned a blind eye to their peculiarities in personal life. Every instance of incest occurred on a legal church basis, meaning, in these specific cases, incest was officially approved by the Catholic Church. However, this was merely the internal kitchen of the Habsburgs. Meanwhile, equally fascinating events were unfolding in the rest of Europe. Let's take a brief look at our own history. Do you know what connects Peter I and one of the figures in our story, the Swedish King Charles XI? It's not just the Battle of Poltava, where they fought against each other. Their descendant ended up on the Russian throne, Peter II. There were many such cases in European history. Essentially, the houses of Europe's ruling monarchies were turning into a single dynasty on a global scale. Look at the famous photo of Nicholas II, his first cousins, Emperor George V of Great Britain and German Kaiser Wilhelm II. Their physical resemblance is no coincidence, but the result of a long genetic process. Anyone who refused to play by these rules was excluded from the line of succession. Finally, Nicholas's son, Tsarevich Alexei, also became a victim of close-kin relationships. His illness, hemophilia, was a defect that circulated through the genealogy of European monarchs and ultimately brought Grigory Rasputin to the Russian royal family. It's hard for us to imagine incest on the scale of such a gigantic system as the European family of monarchies, but the fact remains, incest irrevocably triumphed in aristocratic circles. Even Elizabeth II, essentially, was married to her third cousin, a Greek prince. All European monarchies were bound by kinship ties, but this did not lead to their downfall. There were too many diverse genes in this vast super-dynasty. The Habsburgs, however, were not so fortunate. Incest destroyed them. By the mid-15th century, Spain was no longer the country it once was. If during the era of the great geographical discoveries the country entered with its head held high and hopes for a grand future, 150 years later, not a trace of that optimism remained. Spain was poor and unable to manage its vast wealth in the New World. Instead of investing money in industry, the Spanish Habsburgs spent everything on wars and art. While paintings and statues can now be seen in the Prado Museum in Madrid, wars only drained money and gave almost nothing in return. The 30 Years' War, wars for control over Italy, and attempts to crush the English kingdom demanded tons of gold and silver, but ultimately led only to the loss of territories. The dynasty that could extract gold from thousands of American mines became Europe's biggest debtor. The Habsburgs continued to sink into the abyss of incest. Over nearly 2 centuries on the Spanish throne, they so thoroughly tainted their genetics that not a single healthy trait remained. Of the 11 marriages contracted by the monarchs of the Spanish Habsburg branch, 9 were consanguineous. As a result, infant mortality among them was 50% higher than among rural peasants, despite being attended by the best doctors in the world. The cherry on top was the last Spanish Habsburg on the throne, Charles II, grandson of Philip III and great-great-grandson of Joanna. The mad things were truly dire for him. To put it in perspective, for each of us, if we draw a family tree, we have a father and mother, 2 grandmothers and 2 grandfathers, 4 great-grandmothers and 4 great-grandfathers, and so on. In Charles II's 5th generation, instead of 32 ancestors, there were only 10. His father was his mother's uncle, and his mother was born from a marriage between first cousins, who themselves were products of inbreeding. It sounds like a logic puzzle, but this was the genealogy of just one Habsburg. Charles II was catastrophically unlucky. His father and grandfather, though not geniuses, maintained physical and mental health. Charles, however, was dealt a terrible hand from the start. In the world of Game of Thrones, there's a saying about House Targaryen. With the birth of each new child in this dynasty, the gods flip a coin. The child will either be a genius or a madman. The real-life Targaryen, Charles II, turned out to be utterly incapacitated. If you look at his portraits, you won't understand much. Artists knew how to paint a king to avoid trouble. But Charles's life was far more terrifying than any portrait. He was described as follows: short in stature, frail, with an unattractive face. He couldn't walk upright without leaning on a wall, table, or someone nearby. He was weak in both body and mind. At times, he showed signs of intelligence, memory, and liveliness, but usually, he was apathetic, lethargic, and appeared dull. You could do anything with him because he had no will of his own. The old Habsburg trait, the protruding lower jaw, was no longer just a cosmetic issue. Charles couldn't eat properly because his jaws didn't align. He suffered from epilepsy, bone softening, impotence, daily fainting spells, and hallucinations. Finally, he suffered from mental retardation. He learned to speak at 4 and walk at 8. No one bothered to teach him sciences, understanding it was pointless. Charles mastered basic etiquette to appear decent at court, but that was it. They tried to treat him, but from the perspective of modern medicine, it's clear nothing could be fixed. In the 15th century, doctors believed in better outcomes, and a popular method for treating the young monarch was exorcism sessions. Naturally, this didn't help him. Despite his tragic fate, they tried to secure an heir from Charles. His first wife was a French princess. Imagine her feelings. Your whole life, you're prepared to be the perfect wife and mother of a great monarch, but your husband turns out to be this unfortunate creature who spends his time playing with dwarfs. Additionally, the court received her with hostility due to the tense relations between the French and Spanish. It's no surprise that Charles's wife was in a state of constant depression. She coped with her stress and inability to have children by overeating. In February 1689, after a walk, she felt abdominal pain and died the next day. Rumors circulated that she was poisoned by her mother-in-law, Charles's mother. The king was promptly married to another princess. The German Anna Maria was extraordinarily beautiful, but had a terrible character, arrogant and selfish. She was uninterested in anything. At the wedding, Charles, as if not noticing his wife, enthusiastically ate cakes. While Charles lived out his days, a struggle between 2 women unfolded around his throne. Anna Maria, understanding there would be no heir from their marriage, pushed her own agenda. She was opposed by her mother-in-law, who, as we recall, didn't favor Charles's previous wife either. While the women sorted out their conflicts, the king slowly faded away. Charles II died at 38, a respectable age for his array of ailments. With his death, the male line of the Spanish Habsburgs ended. Charles' I's greatest fear became reality. The Habsburgs lost Spain. Incest, as a tool for preserving power, had the opposite effect. Despite 5 or 6 births per queen, at best, half the children survived their first year, and those who did couldn't live normally due to genetic issues. The Spanish line ended, but the Habsburgs didn't go extinct. The Austrian branch remained, and they intended to reclaim the Spanish crown. However, competitors emerged. Even during Charles II's lifetime, a struggle for the Spanish throne began. 2 main contenders appeared. The first was the Austrian Habsburgs. Charles had a sister married to her uncle, but she died young, and the Austrian Habsburgs' claim to the throne was questioned. The second player was the French Bourbons, who had strong ties to Spain. Charles's first wife was from their dynasty. Ambassadors from Austria and France visited the still-living king. First, the Austrians brought a document transferring the inheritance to their house, and the feeble-minded Charles signed everything. Then the French arrived with a similar proposal, and the king signed again. The will in favor of the Bourbons was signed last, giving them legitimate rights to power in Spain. A few months later, Charles died, and the following year, a new Spanish king from the Bourbon dynasty, Philip V, was crowned. The War of the Spanish Succession began. It was a true zero-world war. Battles were fought not only in Europe, but also in the New World. The French, Spanish, and a dozen smaller countries fought against the combined forces of Austria, Prussia, England, the Netherlands, and numerous minor allies. Up to 1 million people died during the war, all because of incest. In the end, the Spanish throne remained with the Bourbons, and their monarchs rule Spain to this day. But far more interesting events were unfolding in Habsburg Austria. Despite the lower level of inbreeding compared to their Spanish relatives, it didn't save them. 40 years after Charles II's death in 1740, the last male Habsburg died. The great dynasty that dreamed of world domination ceased to exist. A curse uttered in the 10th century by a young pregnant woman had finally come to pass. Knowledgeable people might object. Didn't the Habsburgs continue to rule Austria? Not exactly. The last Habsburg emperor, Charles VI, passed a law allowing his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit power after his death. She became the mother of all new Habsburgs. Her husband was the Duke of Lorraine, and their union became known as the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. For simplicity, they're called Habsburgs, but legally, it's a different dynasty. When we think incest is something distant and barbaric, we're mistaken. According to studies, even today, over 10% of marriages worldwide are between first or second cousins. For comparison, polygamous marriages make up only 2% of the world's total, 5 times fewer than incestuous ones. Consanguineous marriages are becoming less common, but humanity won't rid itself of this tradition despite prohibitions. The history of incest is the history of monarchy and aristocracy. When we open a history textbook and read about past kings, we somehow don't think about who their parents were and how they were related. History is a far more complex thing than it seems at first glance. It hides many secrets we sometimes don't even want to think about. But let's not deny the obvious. Without incest, our world and the map of modern Europe would look completely different. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story with your friends.